The crystal chandeliers of the Ashford Estate Hotel cast light across marble floors where America's wealthiest elite celebrated power and privilege, and at the center stood Victor Halstead, a billionaire CEO who believed nothing could touch him. But when a quiet black boy in worn sneakers walked past security and said one impossible sentence, the room erupted in laughter, because how could this child challenge a man who controlled billions? Except there was something Victor didn't know, something hidden in sealed documents for 13 years, something that would prove the most dangerous person in the room is always the one everyone underestimates. Just before we get back to it, I'd love to know where you're watching from today, and if you're enjoying these stories, make sure you're subscribed. The grand ballroom of the Ashford Estate Hotel had witnessed a century of history. Tonight, it shimmered with a different kind of power. Crystal chandeliers caught the light from 1,000 angles, sending fractured rainbows across marble floors that reflected the polished shoes of America's wealthiest elite. Champagne towers rose like golden monuments near the entrance, where servers in crisp black uniforms glided through the crowd with practiced invisibility. A string quartet played softly from an elevated corner, their music barely audible beneath the constant hum of conversation and laughter. This was the annual gala of Halstead Global, and everyone who mattered was here. Red carpet stretched from the street entrance through the gilded double doors, past velvet ropes where photographers captured arrivals for tomorrow's business sections. Inside, the guest list read like a directory of power: venture capitalists who could fund nations, media moguls who shaped public opinion, politicians whose campaigns depended on nights like these, and celebrities who lent glamour to what was essentially a gathering of predators in expensive suits. At the center of it all stood Victor Halstead. He was 54 but looked a decade younger, with silver threading through dark hair styled just carefully enough to seem effortless. His tailor navy suit probably cost more than most people earned in a year. He moved through the crowd like a man who owned not just the room, but the very air people breathed in it. Handshakes came with that perfect balance of firmness and warmth. His smile reached his eyes at exactly the right moments. When he laughed at someone's joke, they felt like the most interesting person alive. When he turned away, they wondered what they'd done wrong. Victor had built his reputation on being untouchable, ruthless in business, charming in public, and absolutely certain of his place at the top of the world. The evening's program had reached the awards portion. Victor stood on the stage beneath spotlights that made his smile even brighter. He held a crystal trophy shaped like a globe, ready to present the Executive Excellence Award to someone from his own company. The microphone caught every syllable of his smooth voice as he joked with the audience, drawing laughter like a conductor drawing music from an orchestra. And now, Victor said, pausing for effect, "I'd like to call up one of our rising stars." Though I use the term rising generously. The crowd chuckled. A young man in his late 20s approached the stage, his nervous energy visible even from the back rows. His name was Derek Patterson, a junior executive in acquisitions who'd apparently been selected for this moment. He climbed the steps with a smile that didn't quite hide his confusion about why he was being called up. Victor draped an arm around Derek's shoulders with false camaraderie. "Derek here sent me an email last month. Want to know what it said?" Derek's smile froze. He suggested we might be moving too aggressively in the Southeast Asia expansion. Victor's tone remained light, playful even, but something sharp glinted beneath it. He thought perhaps we should consider community impact before finalizing the factory locations. Laughter rippled through the audience. Not kind laughter, the knowing kind. "So I printed that email," Victor continued, framed it, and hung it in my office, as a reminder that sometimes our newest team members bring us fresh perspectives. He paused, letting the moment breathe. Very, very fresh perspectives. The room erupted. Derek stood frozen, his face reddening, trapped between playing along and acknowledging the humiliation. Victor handed him the trophy with a pat on the back that looked supportive but felt like a shove. The message was clear to everyone watching. This is what happens when you question me. Derek descended the stairs to scattered applause, the trophy heavy in his hands, his career trajectory fundamentally altered. Victor returned to the microphone, basking in the energy of the room. This was what he loved, not just the wealth or the power, but the ability to shape reality itself, to make humiliation look like honor, to teach lessons that would echo through his company for months. He was beginning his next remarks when something shifted near the entrance. Security personnel along the ballroom's perimeter stiffened. Small, nearly invisible earpieces delivered messages that changed postures and redirected attention. Guests near the doors turned, their conversations faltering. Whispers began spreading like ripples across still water. A child had entered the ballroom. Not a well-dressed child from some executive's family, trailing behind parents in miniature formal wear. This was a black boy who looked about 12 or 13, wearing clothes that told a different story entirely. Faded jeans with worn knees, sneakers that had seen too many miles, a gray hoodie that had been washed so many times the fabric looked thin and soft. A backpack hung from one shoulder, the kind kids carry to school, patched with duct tape on one corner. He walked past the velvet ropes like they weren't there. Not running, not sneaking, just walking with quiet purpose through a room where he clearly didn't belong. Security moved toward him immediately. Two large men in dark suits converged from different angles, their movements professional but swift. The boy saw them coming and stopped, standing completely still in the middle of the marble floor. He didn't look scared. He didn't look defiant. He simply waited. "Excuse me, son," one guard said, his voice low. "You can't be in here." The boy looked up at him with dark, serious eyes. "I need to speak to Victor Halstead." The second guard exchanged a glance with the first. This wasn't an emergency. No threat, no panic. Just a kid who'd wandered into the wrong event. It happens sometimes at hotels. "Come on, we'll help you find your parents." "I don't need my parents," the boy said quietly. "I need to speak to Victor Halstead." On stage, Victor had noticed the disruption. His presentation had paused, and he watched with curiosity as the security team dealt with whatever minor issue had arisen. He couldn't quite see what was happening through the crowd, but the whispers spreading through the room told him it was something unusual. Then the crowd parted slightly, and Victor saw the boy. For a moment, Victor's expression showed genuine surprise. Then something else took over. Opportunity, entertainment, a chance to demonstrate his generosity and humor to a room full of people who needed reminding why he was exactly where he was. He raised a hand, signaling security to wait. "Hold on, gentlemen. Let's see what this is about." His voice carried across the ballroom, amplified by the microphone. Every head turned. The string quartet's music faded to silence. Even the servers stopped moving, sensing that something unscripted was happening. Victor descended from the stage with easy confidence, his shoes clicking against marble as he crossed the distance to where the boy stood surrounded by confused security. The crowd pressed closer, smartphones appearing in hands, ready to capture whatever came next. Victor approached with his public smile firmly in place. He made a show of kneeling slightly, bringing himself closer to the boy's height. The gesture looked kind, paternal even. "Well now," he said, his voice warm and amused. "This is certainly unexpected. You've got the attention of everyone in this room, young man. That's quite an accomplishment." The boy looked at him without expression. Up close, Victor noted details. The kid's clothes were clean despite being worn. His face was serious, older than his years somehow. His hands gripped the straps of his backpack with steady fingers. "What's your name?" Victor asked, still smiling. "I need to speak to you," the boy replied, not answering the question, not playing the game. Victor's smile widened for the audience. "You're speaking to me now. You've got 10 seconds of my time, which is worth approximately." He paused for effect, pretending to calculate. "Let's call it $5,000. So make it good." Laughter rolled through the crowd. Victor was performing now, and they loved it. The boy's gaze swept across the ballroom. Hundreds of faces watched him, some laughing, some curious, some already losing interest. He looked at the champagne towers and crystal chandeliers, at the jewelry that caught the light, at the sea of expensive fabric and practiced smiles. Then he looked back at Victor and spoke clearly enough for the microphone to catch it. "I'm your boss." The room exploded into laughter. It wasn't polite laughter or restrained chuckling. It was the full-throated hilarity of people who found something genuinely absurd. Victor himself threw his head back, his laughter loud and genuine. When he recovered, he wiped his eyes with exaggerated dramatics. "Of course you are," Victor said, standing to his full height. He performed a deep, theatrical bow. "Your Majesty, I apologize for not recognizing you immediately." He turned to the audience, arms spread wide. "Ladies and gentlemen, apparently I've been working for this young man all along." "Who knew?" More laughter. Someone shouted, "Better give him your office." Another voice called out, "Check his ID." Victor was in his element. He walked in a small circle around the boy, making observations for the crowd. "Let's see. The designer backpack. The haute couture sneakers with the authentic streetwear." He gestured at the boy's clothes with mock seriousness. "Yes, clearly this is someone who controls a multi-billion-dollar empire." The boy's jaw tightened, but he didn't move. His hands were clenched around his backpack straps, so hard his knuckles showed pale against his dark skin. Victor leaned down again, his smile still in place, but his voice dropping slightly. Not quite as loud, still amplified, but with a different edge. "Let me give you some advice, kid. Whatever game you're playing, whatever dare your friends gave you, it's over now. Security is going to escort you out, and we'll all have a good laugh about this tomorrow." He straightened up and motioned to the guards. "Gentlemen, please see our young CEO out of the building." But the boy didn't move when the guard approached. He kept his eyes on Victor and spoke again, his voice still quiet but carrying in the now hushed room. "You work for a company you don't own. They trained me to find you." The laughter died down to confused murmurs. A few people in the crowd exchanged glances. That was an odd thing for a kid to say. Specific, not the kind of thing a child would make up on a dare. Victor's smile remained, but something shifted in his eyes. He studied the boy more carefully now. "Who trained you? And trained you for what exactly?" The boy didn't answer. Near the stage, several older executives had gone very still. A silver-haired woman in an elegant black dress set down her champagne glass with a hand that trembled slightly. Her eyes were fixed on the boy with an intensity that had nothing to do with curiosity. Victor's patience was wearing thin. The moment had gone on too long. What started as entertainment was becoming awkward. He needed to end this cleanly. He leaned down one final time, his smile gone, replaced by something colder. "Listen to me very carefully," Victor said, his voice low enough that only the boy and the nearest guest could hear, though the microphone still caught hints of it. "I don't know what delusions you're living with, or what charity case situation you crawled out of tonight, but you need to understand something. There are places in this world for people like you, and places for people like me. This room? This isn't your place. It will never be your place. So whatever fantasy you're entertaining about being in charge, about being important, about being anything other than exactly what you appear to be, let go. Know your place. Accept it. And get out of my sight." The words hung in the air like poison. The room had gone completely silent. Even those who'd been laughing moments ago felt uncomfortable now. The cruelty in Victor's voice was impossible to miss. The boy's hands clenched tighter on his backpack straps. His breathing quickened. For a moment, it looked like he might cry, might break under the weight of those words delivered in front of hundreds of people. But he didn't cry. He lifted his chin slightly and held Victor's gaze for 3 long seconds. Then security took him by the arm, firmly but not roughly. They began guiding him toward the exit. The crowd parted, creating a path. Smartphones captured his departure from every angle. As the guards walked him past the stage area, the boy's eyes swept the room one more time. They landed on the silver-haired woman near the front tables. She stood frozen, one hand raised to her mouth, her champagne glass forgotten on the floor where it had slipped from her other hand and shattered. The boy and the woman locked eyes for perhaps 2 seconds. Recognition flashed across her face like lightning. Her lips parted, forming a word that didn't quite make it to sound. Her complexion went pale beneath expertly applied makeup. Then the boy was past her, being escorted through the gilded doors and out of sight. The moment he disappeared, conversation erupted throughout the ballroom. Victor returned to the stage, laughing it off, making jokes about increased security at next year's event. The audience laughed along, slowly returning to their champagne and their networking. But the silver-haired woman remained standing, staring at the doors long after they'd closed. Her hand shook. After a moment, she bent to retrieve her dropped glass, fumbling with it before giving up and walking quickly toward the restrooms. Victor noticed her departure but thought nothing of it. He was too busy accepting congratulations for how he'd handled the situation, for turning a potential disruption into entertainment. He had no idea that in those few moments, everything had begun to change. The ballroom returned to its celebration. The string quartet resumed playing. Champagne flowed and deals were discussed, and the powerful returned to doing what they did best, consolidating more power. Outside in the cool night air, none of them saw what happened next. The morning after the gala, Victor sat in his corner office 70 stories above the city, watching financial news on 3 different screens. His phone buzzed constantly with messages from people who'd been at the event. Most were jokes about his new young boss. Some were congratulations on how he'd handled the situation. A few were questions disguised as jokes, asking where the boy had come from. Victor replied to the important ones with practiced humor. The incident had become part of his legend already. By afternoon, it would be an anecdote. By next week, forgotten. Except it wasn't forgotten. His assistant knocked and entered without waiting for permission, which meant something required his immediate attention. She carried a tablet, and her expression was carefully neutral. "Mr. Halstead, you have 3 separate inquiries from board members this morning." Victor glanced up, mildly annoyed. "About quarterly projections? About last night?" He set down his coffee. "Excuse me." She handed him the tablet. 3 emails, all sent within an hour of each other. One from Thomas Brennan, who controlled the pension fund investments. One from Catherine Mills, who represented the European division. And one from Margaret Crown, the silver-haired woman who dropped her glass. Each email asked the same basic question in different corporate language. "Who was the child who approached you last night?" Victor felt the first small thread of irritation. Reply to all 3. Tell them it was a random disruption. Hotel security is reviewing how he got past the entrance. Nothing to concern themselves with. His assistant nodded but didn't leave. "What?" Victor asked. Ms. Crown marked her email urgent and requested a call back within the hour. Victor stared at the screen. Margaret Crown had been with the company longer than almost anyone. She predated Victor's appointment as CEO by 15 years. She rarely attended the gala anymore, claiming health issues, but she'd made an exception this year. And now she was marking emails urgent about a kid in a hoodie. "Tell her I'll call this afternoon," Victor said finally. After his assistant left, he stood at his window, looking down at the city grid far below. Something about last night bothered him more than he wanted to admit. Not the boy himself. Kids got into places they shouldn't all the time. But the sentence he'd said, "You work for a company you don't own." Victor had built his career on knowing every detail of Halstead global structure. He'd studied the corporate hierarchy, the stock distributions, the board relationships. He knew exactly who owned what and why. That knowledge was power. So where would a child get language like that? "They trained me to find you." Victor picked up his phone and called his head of security. Outside the Ashford Estate Hotel, the boy had been released onto the sidewalk shortly after being escorted out. The security team had been professional about it. No roughness, no police called. They'd asked where his parents were, offered to call someone, but the boy had simply said he could get home on his own. They'd watched him walk away down the street, just another kid on a city sidewalk at night. What they hadn't noticed was the black sedan parked across the street, engine running, headlights off. A woman sat in the driver's seat, her face barely visible in the darkness. She wore a baseball cap pulled low and kept her hands on the steering wheel, watching as the boy appeared through the hotel's front entrance. She tensed when she saw him, leaning forward slightly, her fingers tightening. The boy paused on the sidewalk, looking both ways. His eyes found the sedan immediately. For a long moment, they stared at each other across 30 feet of City Street. Then the boy turned and walked in the opposite direction. The woman's hands relaxed on the wheel. She didn't follow. After watching him disappear around a corner, she started the engine and drove away in a different direction entirely. The boy walked 6 blocks before entering a subway station. He descended stairs worn smooth by a million footsteps, used a farewell card to pass through the turnstiles, and caught the next train heading north. He sat in a mostly empty car, backpack on his lap, watching the darkness beyond the windows as stations flashed past. 40 minutes later, he exited in a neighborhood that looked nothing like the one containing the Ashford estate. Here, buildings wore their age without elegance. Graffiti marked the walls. Corner stores had security bars over their windows. The people on the sidewalks walked with their heads down. The boy entered a 6-story apartment, building through a door that didn't quite close properly anymore. He climbed stairs to the 4th floor and knocked on a door marked 4C. It opened immediately. The man standing there was in his mid-30s, black, with close-cropped hair and eyes that missed nothing. He wore jeans and a plain gray shirt. No jewelry, no distinctive features, nothing that would make him memorable in a crowd. He stepped aside to let the boy enter, then closed the door and engaged 3 separate locks. The apartment was small. One main room serving as kitchen and living space. A single bedroom visible through an open door. Everything was clean but sparse. No photographs on the walls. No personal items visible except for a laptop on the small dining table. "How do you feel?" the man asked. His voice was controlled, precise. The boy set his backpack on the floor and sat on the couch. "I did what you said. I know. I was watching the live stream." The man sat across from him in a folding chair. "You spoke clearly. You made eye contact. You didn't panic when he mocked you. He was cruel. Yes, he was. Did you cry?" "No." "Good." The man's expression softened slightly. "That was the hardest part. That's over now." The boy looked at his hands. "I thought it would feel different. I thought maybe he'd recognize something or stop, or—" He trailed off. "He's not capable of that kind of recognition," the man said. "Men like Victor Halstead see only what confirms what they already believe. You weren't there to change his mind. You were there to be seen." "By who?" "By someone who remembers." The man stood and moved to the laptop. "Did you notice the woman who dropped her glass?" The boy nodded. "Her name is Margaret Crown. She's been on the board since before you were born. She knew your mother." He turned the laptop screen toward the boy. It showed a paused video of the gala, frozen on the moment when the boy and Margaret had locked eyes. "She recognized you." "How?" "Because you look exactly like someone she hasn't seen in 13 years. The boy stared at the frozen image. Margaret's face showed shock, recognition, and something else. Fear maybe, or hope. "Did I fail?" the boy asked quietly. The man turned off the laptop and looked at him directly. "No, you were seen. That's all that mattered. Everything else follows from that." In his office, Victor's head of security arrived within 20 minutes. James Garrett was a former military man who'd transitioned into corporate protection. He understood that his real job wasn't just preventing physical threats, but managing information and maintaining secrecy. "I need background on someone," Victor said without preamble. "Child, black, male, approximately 12 to 13 years old. He approached me at last night's gala, claiming to work for the company." Garrett pulled out a tablet. "I already pulled security footage. We have clear images of his face. I'll run them through every database we have access to. School records, juvenile services, foster care system, hospital records. How long? If he's in the system, I'll have something by end of business today." But end of business came and went with no results. Garrett returned to Victor's office at 7 that evening with a confused expression. "Nothing?" Victor asked. "Worse than nothing." Garrett set his tablet on Victor's desk. "I ran his image through 17 different databases. Facial recognition software flagged 0 matches in school enrollment records, no matches in the foster care system, no hospital records, no juvenile detention files. It's like he doesn't exist." Victor picked up the tablet, scrolling through the search results. "All negative. Everyone exists somewhere. Birth certificates, vaccination records, something." "That's the part that concerns me," Garrett said carefully. "Kids fall through cracks in the system all the time. Runaways, undocumented situations, homeless youth. But those kids don't just walk into the Ashford estate dressed like they're going to school. This wasn't a street kid looking for food. His clothes were worn but clean. His backpack had school supplies. Someone's taking care of him. Keep looking. There's something else." Garrett hesitated. "I expanded the search parameters, cross-referenced with law enforcement databases. And his facial data was flagged." Victor looked up sharply. "What kind of flag?" "The access-restricted kind. Someone with high-level authority marked that face as sensitive. The database wouldn't tell me who or why, just that attempting to run additional searches would be logged and reported. The office went very quiet. Outside the windows, the city sparkled with evening lights. Someone erased him from the system, Victor said slowly, or protected him from appearing in it. That level of authority doesn't come from local resources, Garrett said. This is federal level at minimum, possibly higher. Victor set down the tablet carefully. Find out who has that kind of access. After Garrett left, Victor sat alone in his office as darkness deepened outside. The irritation he'd felt that morning had evolved into something else. Concern maybe, or the beginning of real unease. He pulled up the security footage from last night, watching the boys approach again. The way he'd walked through the ballroom, the calm in his voice, the specific words he'd chosen. You work for a company you don't own. Victor had built his career on control, on knowing exactly where he stood and why. The idea that something existed outside his knowledge, something that could walk right up to him and challenge his authority in front of hundreds of witnesses, was intolerable. He made a decision. He wouldn't wait for Garrett's official channels. He would hire private investigators, people with fewer limitations on how they found information. Across the city, in the fourth-floor apartment, the boys studied documents spread across the small dining table. Financial reports, corporate structure diagrams, news articles about Halstead Global's expansion into various markets. The man who'd trained him stood in the kitchen, making simple sandwiches for dinner. You should rest, he said. Tomorrow we move to the next location. Why do we have to move? Because they're looking for you now. And when they can't find you through normal channels, they'll try other ways. The boy looked at a photograph pinned to the wall. It showed the original Ashford building from decades ago, before the luxury hotel. 3 people stood in front of it. A middle-aged white man in a suit, a younger black woman in professional clothes, and a third person whose face had been torn from the photo. Is that him? The boy asked. The founder? Yes, that's Jonathan Ashford. He built the first version of what became Halstead Global. And that's my mother? Yes. The boy traced the torn section with one finger. Who's the third person? Someone who was removed from the story when she became inconvenient. In her home across the city, Margaret Crown sat in a study lined with bookshelves. On her desk sat a locked case she hadn't opened in over a decade. The key hung on a chain around her neck, hidden beneath her clothes. She'd been wrestling with herself since the moment she'd seen the boy's face, telling herself she was imagining things, that grief and guilt could create patterns where none existed. That was impossible. But his eyes, the shape of his face, the way he'd stood there, calm and certain despite being surrounded by mockery. She'd seen those same qualities in someone else years ago. Margaret removed the key from around her neck. Her hand shook as she unlocked the case and opened it. Inside were documents, letters, old photographs, and a sealed envelope marked with Jonathan Ashford's distinctive handwriting. She picked up one photograph carefully. It showed her much younger, standing beside Jonathan and a brilliant young woman who'd been his closest advisor. The woman held a baby, maybe 6 months old, with serious dark eyes. Margaret had been there the day that photograph was taken. She'd been there when everything fell apart, and she'd kept these documents hidden for 13 years, sworn to secrecy by a man who'd understood that secrets were sometimes the only protection. She picked up her phone and dialed a number she hadn't called in 3 years. It rang 4 times before someone answered. An older man's voice, cautious. Margaret. Thomas, she said. We need to talk. Privately. Tomorrow. What is this about? Margaret looked at the photograph of the baby with serious eyes. I need to ask you something, and I need the truth. Is the Lazarus Protocol active? The silence on the other end of the line stretched so long she thought the connection had dropped. When Thomas Brennan finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. How do you know that name? Answer the question. I can't. Not over the phone. Meet me tomorrow. Noon. The place we use for the Ashford estate negotiations. He hung up. Margaret set down her phone and looked again at the documents scattered across her desk. If the Lazarus Protocol was active, then everything Jonathan had predicted was coming true. The contingencies he'd built into the company's very foundation were beginning to activate. And Victor Halstead, for all his power and confidence, had no idea what was coming. The next morning, Victor arrived at his office to find his assistant waiting with an unusual expression. "Sir, you have a notification from the board of directors." He took the tablet she offered. An email had arrived at 6 that morning, formal in tone, marked priority. It informed him that a closed emergency board session had been triggered for the first time in the company's modern history. Attendance, mandatory. Topic, undisclosed. Date, 3 days from now. Location, the Executive Conference Center on the 60th floor. The email included no explanation, no agenda, no preparatory materials. Victor read it 3 times. In 15 years as CEO, he'd never seen anything like this. Board meetings were scheduled months in advance. Emergency sessions dealt with scandals or financial crises and always came with reams of documentation. This was different. He called the board chair's office immediately. The assistant said the chair was unavailable for calls. He tried 3 other board members. None would take his call. Victor stood at his window, the tablet still in his hand, and felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Uncertainty. Outside, somewhere in the city, the boy packed his few belongings into his worn backpack while the man who'd trained him made encrypted calls on a burner phone. Across town, Margaret Crown drove to a private meeting with Thomas Brennan, carrying documents that could end careers or change everything. And in a location known to only 3 people in the world, a woman watched security footage of the gala on a laptop, tears streaming down her face as she saw her son for the first time in years, standing in a ballroom full of people who had no idea who he really was. The wheels that had been set in motion years ago were beginning to turn. And Victor Halstead, who'd spent the previous evening mocking a child in worn sneakers, had just received his first notification that the game had changed. He just didn't know the rules yet. 3 days after Victor received the emergency board notification, he stood outside the Executive Conference Center on the 60th floor, staring at doors that had never been closed to him before. 2 security personnel he didn't recognize flanked the entrance. They wore suits identical to Halstead Global's standard corporate protection uniform, but their faces were unfamiliar. Victor approached with the confidence of someone who owned every room he entered. "I'm here for the board session." One guard checked a tablet. "Mr. Halstead, please surrender your phone and any recording devices." Victor's jaw tightened. "That's not standard protocol. It is for this meeting, sir." He'd attended hundreds of board meetings. Never once had phones been confiscated. This was the kind of security reserved for classified government briefings or criminal investigations. He pulled his phone from his pocket and handed it over, watching as it disappeared into a locked box. The guards opened the doors. Inside, the conference room had been transformed. Heavy curtains blocked the floor-to-ceiling windows that normally offered panoramic city views. Additional security personnel stood at intervals along the walls. At the head of the long mahogany table sat Edward Whitmore, the board chair, flanked by the company's chief legal counsel and 2 attorneys Victor had never seen before. 12 board members were already seated. Margaret Crown sat 3 chairs from the head of the table, her expression unreadable. Thomas Brennan avoided Victor's eyes entirely. The others looked uncomfortable, confused, or carefully blank. Victor took his usual seat near the head of the table, directly across from Edward. "Someone want to tell me what this is about?" Edward's voice was formal, devoid of its usual warmth. "This session has been convened under Article 17 of the company's original charter. All proceedings are confidential and legally binding." Victor had studied the corporate charter when he'd become CEO. Article 17 dealt with emergency governance protocols. It hadn't been invoked in the company's entire modern history. "What emergency requires?" "Mr. Halstead," Edward interrupted. "Before we proceed, I need to ask you a direct question. 3 nights ago, at the annual gala, did a minor child approach you and make claims regarding this company?" The room went completely still. Victor felt every eye turned toward him. A kid wandered into the hotel. Security handled it. "I don't see how a minor disruption requires this level of—" "Please answer the question directly," Edward said. "Did a child approach you?" Yes or no? Yes. And did this child make any specific statements about ownership or authority within Halstead Global? Victor's instincts screamed warning. He was being led somewhere, but he couldn't see where. He said some nonsense. Kids say a lot of things. Margaret spoke for the first time, her voice cutting through the tension. He said, "I'm your boss." Those were his exact words. Weren't they, Victor? Victor turned to her slowly. "You were there. You tell me." "I was there," Margaret confirmed. "And I recognized him." The room seemed to shift. Several board members leaned forward. Edward's expression remained carefully neutral, but his hands tightened on the folder in front of him. "Recognized him as who?" Victor demanded. Margaret didn't answer. Instead, she looked at Edward and nodded once. The board chair opened his folder and removed a single document. "What I'm about to share was sealed by order of this board 13 years ago. The seal was designed to be broken only under specific circumstances." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. Those circumstances have now occurred. Victor's mind raced through possibilities. Corporate scandals, hidden debts, illegal activities. Whatever this was, it predated his time as CEO. He could distance himself from it. Use it even. "I'm listening." Edward slid the document across the table to the chief legal counsel, who stood and began reading in a flat, professional tone. By unanimous vote of the board of directors on March 14th, 13 years ago, the following resolution was enacted. In the event of disputed succession, contested ownership, or violation of founding principles as defined in attached appendices, a dormant corporate mechanism known as the Lazarus Trust shall be activated. The words meant nothing to Victor. He'd never heard of a Lazarus Trust. "What does this have to do with?" "Everything," Margaret said quietly. "It has to do with everything." The legal counsel continued. "The Lazarus Trust, established by founder Jonathan Ashford 6 months before his death, contains controlling interest in Halstead Global through a network of shell companies, overseas holdings, and strategic stock acquisitions made over a 20-year period. This trust was designed to remain dormant and invisible until specific triggering conditions were met." Victor felt the first real tendril of fear curl in his chest. "That's impossible. I know every major shareholder. I've seen the ownership breakdowns." "You've seen what we wanted you to see," Thomas Brennan said, speaking for the first time. His voice shook slightly. Jonathan made sure of that. The room fell silent as the legal counsel produced another document. This one looked ancient, the paper yellowed with age. The trust activation requires 2 conditions. First, documented evidence of ethical violations severe enough to threaten the company's founding mission. Second, the verified existence and identification of a specific biological heir. Victor's blood went cold. "What heir?" Edward looked directly at him. Jonathan Ashford had a research partner, a brilliant woman named Dr. Elise Freeman, who helped develop the core technologies that built this company's fortune. She was more than a partner, Victor. She was essential. And when she discovered illegal expansions, human rights violations in our overseas operations, and financial manipulation by board members, she threatened to expose everything. "I don't know anything about." "Let him finish," Margaret said sharply. Edward continued. Rather than address her concerns, the board at that time forced Jonathan to choose between the company's survival and Dr. Freeman's reputation. He chose the company. She was publicly discredited, her contributions erased from official records, her name removed from patents and papers. 6 months after she disappeared from public life, she gave birth to a son. The conference room felt like it was closing in. Victor gripped the edge of the table. "You're telling me that child at the gala is Jonathan Ashford's biological son," Margaret finished, "and Dr. Elise Freeman's, making him the legitimate heir to the Lazarus Trust and the controlling authority over everything we've built." Victor shot to his feet. "This is insane. You're basing this on what? A kid who walked into a hotel? Anyone could claim to be." "We ran DNA analysis," Edward said calmly. "From the moment Margaret identified him, we knew we had to verify. Security footage provided clear images. We have genetic samples from Jonathan Ashford's medical records. The match is conclusive. DNA can be faked. Results can be manipulated. By 3 independent laboratories? Thomas asked. By forensic geneticists with no connection to this company? We've spent the last 72 hours verifying every detail, Victor. The boy is exactly who he feared he was. Victor felt his control slipping. Feared? You're talking about giving control of a multi-billion-dollar company to a child? Based on some trust you claim Jonathan set up before he died. Margaret stood, her movements slow but deliberate. She walked to the head of the table and placed a flash drive in front of Edward. Jonathan knew this day might come. He knew that if his son survived to adulthood, it would mean the company had become exactly what he feared it would. A mechanism for exploitation rather than innovation. Edward inserted the flash drive into a laptop. The room screens flickered to life, showing video footage that looked decades old. The image quality was poor, but the face was unmistakable. Jonathan Ashford, looking older and tired, sat in what appeared to be a home office. His voice came through the speakers, crackling with age but clear in its message. If you're watching this, it means my son has come forward. It means the contingencies I built into this company's foundation have been triggered. And it means that those I trusted to carry forward my vision have failed. Victor stared at the screen, watching a dead man deliver judgment from beyond the grave. Jonathan continued. I built Halstead Global on principles of innovation and ethical responsibility. But I allowed fear and ambition to corrupt those principles. I allowed brilliant people like Elise to be sacrificed for short-term gain. I built protections into the company's very structure because I knew, deep in my soul, that without safeguards, everything I created would be used to hurt the very communities it was meant to help. The video showed Jonathan's hands shaking as he held up documents. The Lazarus Trust isn't about bloodline or dynasty. It's about correction. If my son is presenting himself to you now, it means you violated every principle I tried to preserve. It means the company needs to be rebuilt from the ground up, and he is the key to that rebuilding. The video ended. The conference room remained silent for a long moment. Victor felt like the floor had opened beneath his feet. 15 years of work, of climbing, of strategic maneuvering, all of it built on a foundation that had never been real. This doesn't prove anything, Victor said, but his voice lacked conviction. So, Jonathan recorded a video. So what? The legal structure of this company is clear. Stock ownership, board authority, executive contracts. None of that changes because of some hidden trust. Actually, one of the unfamiliar attorneys said, standing for the first time, it changes everything. I represent the Lazarus Trust. My firm has been the trust's legal guardian for 13 years, maintaining its structure and monitoring the company for triggering conditions. 6 months ago, we documented sufficient violations of the founder's ethical guidelines. The human rights complaints from the Southeast Asian operations alone would have been enough. The financial manipulation that led to 3 executive removals sealed it. Victor's mind flashed to Derek Patterson at the gala, to the executives who'd been quietly pushed out over the years, to expansion decisions he'd made without fully investigating their impact. I did what was necessary for growth. You did what Jonathan feared someone would do, Margaret said. You prioritized profit over people. You turned this company into exactly the kind of machine he'd tried to prevent. And in doing so, you triggered the very mechanism designed to stop you. Where is this boy now? Victor demanded. If he's so important, why isn't he here? He's being kept safe, Edward replied, until we're certain of your response to this information. Victor looked around the table at faces that had been allies, that had voted for his initiatives, that had celebrated his successes. Now, they looked at him like he was already gone. You're actually considering this. Giving control to a child who knows nothing about running a company. The trust doesn't require him to run anything, Thomas said. It requires him to hold ultimate authority, to prevent anyone from making the kinds of decisions that hurt people for profit. The operational structure can remain largely intact. Largely? Victor seized on the word. What changes? You, Margaret said simply. You change. Your role, your authority, your future with this company. All of it changes. Victor felt rage building beneath his fear. I've given 15 years to Halstead Global. I've tripled its value. I've expanded into markets that exploit vulnerable populations, Margaret interrupted, that ignore environmental concerns, that prioritize shareholder returns over human dignity. Yes, Victor, we know what you built. That's exactly why we're here. The board chair stood, signaling that the session was approaching its conclusion. Mr. Halstead, we're informing you of these developments as a courtesy and a legal requirement. The Lazarus Trust's activation cannot be stopped or reversed. The boy's identity has been verified through every means available to us. Within the next 72 hours, there will be a second gathering, a formal presentation of authority. And if I refuse to recognize it, Edward's expression hardened. Then you'll be removed by security and face legal consequences for breach of contract. Every agreement you signed as CEO included provisions requiring adherence to the founder's original charter. You're bound by those terms whether you knew about the Lazarus Trust or not. Victor felt his world collapsing. Everything he'd built, every sacrifice he'd made, every person he'd stepped over to reach this position, all of it was being pulled out from under him by a child in worn sneakers. This is insane. It's justice, Margaret said quietly. The kind Jonathan believed in. The kind Elise deserved. And the kind that boy has been prepared his entire life to deliver. The meeting ended without resolution, without compromise, without any path forward that left Victor's position intact. As board members filed out, some avoided his eyes entirely. Others looked at him with something like pity. Victor remained seated long after the room emptied, staring at the blank screens where Jonathan Ashford's ghost had delivered its verdict. His phone was returned at the door. The moment he was back in his office, Victor made a call to the private investigation firm he'd hired days earlier. I don't care what it costs or what laws you have to bend. Find me everything on that boy. Where he lives, who's protecting him, what leverage points exist. I want in 48 hours. Then he made a second call to a media consultant who specialized in crisis management. I need to prepare a narrative. Something about corporate sabotage, foreign interference, anything that makes this sound like an attack rather than a legitimate succession. He was not going to let a child take everything he'd built, not without a fight. 48 hours later, Victor stood in his bathroom at home, adjusting his tie with mechanical precision. In the mirror, his reflection looked calm, composed, ready for battle. But his hands betrayed him with the slightest tremor. Today was the formal presentation, the moment when the board would officially introduce the boy and transfer authority. Victor had spent 2 sleepless nights preparing his response, consulting with lawyers, strategizing his defense. He'd found sympathetic board members, ones who thought the Lazarus Trust was an overreach, who believed experience mattered more than bloodline. He had allies. He had arguments. He had a plan. The presentation was being held not at headquarters, but at an exclusive private estate outside the city. The location itself was a message. This was about old money, old power, old agreements that existed before Victor had ever heard of Halstead Global. Victor's driver took him through gates that opened on a manicured grounds. The main house was a mansion built in the previous century, all stone and history and quiet wealth. Other cars were already parked in the circular drive. Board members arriving early, gathering before the main event. Victor exited his car and walked toward the entrance with his head high. He was ready for this. Whatever they thought they were going to do, he would counter it. He would find the weakness in their plan and exploit it. Security met him at the front door. Not the rental guards from the board meeting, but the same 2 unfamiliar faces he'd seen before. They looked at him with expressions that held no deference. "Mr. Halstead," one said, "please follow me." They led him not toward the main entrance, but to a side door. Victor's confidence faltered. "The meeting is in the main hall, isn't it?" "This way, sir." They brought him to a smaller anteroom. Through interior windows, Victor could see into a much larger conference hall. Board members were already seated around a massive table. Legal counsel lined the walls. At the head of the table sat several empty chairs. And then Victor saw the boy. He sat calmly in one of those chairs at the head of the table, wearing clean clothes that still looked modest. Dark pants, a white shirt, nothing flashy. Margaret Crown sat beside him, speaking quietly. On his other side sat one of the unfamiliar attorneys from the emergency session. Victor moved toward the hall's main entrance. Security stepped in front of him. "I'm sorry, Mr. Halstead. You're not cleared to enter yet." "Not cleared?" Victor's voice rose. "This is a company proceeding. I'm the CEO. Please wait here. You'll be called when appropriate." Victor stared at them in disbelief. He looked through the windows at the gathering inside. Board members he'd worked with for years sat around that table. Not one of them looked toward the anteroom. Not one seemed concerned that he wasn't present. The security guard's earpiece crackled. He listened, then nodded. "Mr. Halstead, you can enter now. Please take the seat indicated by the board chair." The doors opened. Victor walked into the conference hall, expecting his usual position near the head of the table. Instead, Edward Whitmore gestured to a chair near the middle, well away from the power positions, sandwiched between two junior board members. Victor stopped walking. "That's not my seat." "Today it is," Edward said simply. The room watched as Victor made his decision. He could refuse, storm out, make a scene, or he could sit and fight from within. He chose the latter, walking stiffly to the indicated chair and lowering himself into it with barely controlled anger. Edward stood, and the room fell silent. This session has been convened to formally recognize the activation of the Lazarus Trust and the transfer of controlling authority to its designated heir. Present today are all sitting board members, senior legal counsel, representatives from the Trust's administrative office, and relevant witnesses. He gestured toward the boy. "For those who haven't been briefed, this is Julian Freeman Ashford, biological son of company founder Jonathan Ashford and Dr. Elise Freeman. His identity has been verified through genetic testing, sealed birth records, and documentation maintained by the Trust since his birth." Julian. The boy finally had a name. Victor studied him from across the table. The child looked back with those same serious eyes from the gala. No fear. No triumph. Just quiet observation. "Before we proceed with the formal recognition," Edward continued, "Mr. Halstead has requested an opportunity to present objections." Victor, all eyes turned to him. This was his moment. Victor stood slowly, commanding attention the way he always had. "Thank you. I want to make something very clear to everyone in this room. I have dedicated 15 years of my life to Halstead Global. I have grown this company from a respectable firm into a global powerhouse. Our stock value has tripled. Our market reach has expanded into 17 new countries. We employ over 50,000 people worldwide." He paused, letting his accomplishments hang in the air. "And now you're telling me that all of that means nothing because of a trust one never knew existed? That a child with no business experience, no understanding of global markets, no track record whatsoever, should somehow have authority over decisions that affect thousands of lives?" Victor turned to address Julian directly. "I don't know what story you've been told. I don't know who convinced you that you belong at this table. But running a company isn't a birthright. It's earned through years of work, of sacrifice, of making impossible decisions that keep people employed and shareholders confident." Julian didn't respond. He simply watched Victor with those unnerving, steady eyes. "This is about more than just ownership," Victor continued, addressing the full table now. "This is about competence, about reality. You can't hand control of a multi-billion-dollar empire to someone who can't even vote, who's never managed a team, who probably doesn't understand half the financial instruments we use daily." Several board members shifted uncomfortably. Victor pressed his advantage. "I'm proposing a compromise. Keep the trust structure if you must, but let it remain symbolic. I'll continue as CEO with full operational authority. The boy can be educated, brought into the company gradually, prepared for eventual leadership when he's actually ready. That's reasonable. That's responsible." He sat down, confident he'd made his case. The room remained silent for a moment. Then Julian spoke for the first time. His voice was quiet but carried clearly through the hall. He failed the test. Victor frowned. "What?" Julian looked at Edward. "May I?" The board chair nodded. Julian stood, and the room seemed to shift around him. Despite his age, despite his size, something about his presence commanded attention. "You're right about one thing, Mr. Halstead. Running a company is hard. It requires difficult decisions. But you made those decisions based on only one principle: profit. He gestured to one of the attorneys, who activated screens around the room. Financial documents appeared, detailing expansion into Southeast Asian markets. You approved factory locations in areas where labor regulations were minimal, where workers had no protections, where children as young as 11 worked assembly lines. Victor's jaw clenched. Those were competitive business decisions in emerging markets. You knew, Julian said simply. You received reports about conditions. You chose to ignore them because addressing them would cut into profit margins. More documents appeared. Environmental impact studies that had been buried. Safety violations that had been settled quietly. Whistleblower complaints that had resulted in terminations rather than investigations. The Lazarus Trust wasn't created to transfer wealth, Julian continued. It was created to prevent this company from becoming exactly what you made it. A machine that consumes people and calls it progress. Actually, Edward said quietly, we just did. The Lazarus Trust holds 51% voting control through its network of holdings. That was verified 3 days ago by independent auditors. This isn't a coup, Victor. This is a designed mechanism finally doing what it was always meant to do. Who holds that voting control? Victor demanded. Who actually makes the decisions? Edward looked at Julian. He does. The room remained silent as those words settled. Victor stared at the boy who'd walked into his gala in worn sneakers, who he'd mocked in front of hundreds, who now sat at the head of the table with the power to end his career. Julian finally looked directly at Victor and spoke one more time. You're not the highest authority in this company. You never were. My father made sure of that. Victor opened his mouth to respond, to argue, to threaten. But Edward cut him off. Security will escort you from the premises. Your office will be packed and sent to you. All access credentials have been revoked. You're no longer authorized to speak on behalf of Halstead Global or any of its subsidiaries. 2 security guards approached, the same ones who'd made Victor wait in the anteroom. They stood on either side of him, not threatening, but unmistakably present. This isn't over, Victor said, his voice shaking with rage and disbelief. I have lawyers. I have connections. I'll fight this. You're welcome to try, Margaret said. But everything we've done is legal and documented. Jonathan spent years building these protections. You can't undo them just because you don't like the results. Victor looked one last time at Julian, searching for something: weakness, doubt, fear. The boy looked back with those same calm eyes. No bloating, no anger, just certainty. State your full legal name, the lead attorney said formally. For the record. Julian stood straight, and when he spoke, his voice carried through the hall with perfect clarity. Julian Freeman Ashford, legal heir to the Lazarus Trust, son of Jonathan Ashford and Dr. Elise Freeman. Half the room stood in response, not because they were required to, but because the moment demanded it. Recognition of something that had been hidden for 13 years, now finally brought into the light. Victor remained seated, stunned, as the reality crashed over him. He'd lost, not just his position, not just his authority, but the entire narrative he'd built about himself. He was no longer the brilliant CEO who transformed a company. He was the cautionary tale about what happened when power went unchecked. Security touched his elbow gently. Sir, it's time to go. Victor stood mechanically and walked toward the exit. As he passed Julian's chair, he stopped for just a moment. What happens now? He asked quietly. Julian looked up at him. The truth happens, and then we rebuild. Victor was escorted out through the side door he'd entered through, past windows showing a conference room full of people who'd moved on from his existence already. His car waited in the drive, engine running. As they drove away from the estate, Victor pulled out his phone with shaking hands. He began making calls to lawyers, to allies in the media, to anyone who might help him salvage something from his disaster. But deep down, he knew the game was over, and he'd never even known he was playing it. Back in the conference hall, Julian sat down quietly. Margaret touched his shoulder with gentle approval. Around the table, board members began asking questions, starting the complex process of unwinding years of decisions and figuring out what came next. But for just a moment, Julian allowed himself to feel the weight of what had just happened. He'd done exactly what he'd been trained to do. He'd walked into the center of power and spoken truth to people who'd forgotten how to hear it. And they'd listened. The real work was just beginning. But today, for the first time in 13 years, the company his father built was finally back on the path it was meant to follow. Outside, Victor's car disappeared through the gates, carrying a man who'd entered as a CEO and left as nothing more than a memory of what not to become. The conference hall remained charged with tension even after Victor's departure. Board members who had stood in recognition of Julian slowly returned to their seats, exchanging uncertain glances. The weight of what they'd just witnessed hung heavy in the air. Edward Whitmore cleared his throat, drawing attention back to the head of the table. We have significant work ahead of us. The trust activation doesn't just remove Victor from power. It requires a complete audit of company operations and a restructuring of decision-making processes. Thomas Brennan raised a hand tentatively. What exactly does that mean for operational continuity? We have contracts in motion, quarterly projections due, investor calls scheduled for next week. The lead trust attorney, a woman named Patricia Hendricks, stood to address the room. The Lazarus Trust isn't designed to disrupt legitimate business operations. It's designed to ensure ethical oversight. Day-to-day functions continue under existing management structures. However, any decisions involving worker welfare, environmental impact, or community relations now require trust approval. And who provides that approval? Catherine Mills asked from across the table. Patricia gestured toward Julian. The trust's designated heir holds veto authority over major decisions. He doesn't need to understand every financial instrument or market strategy. He needs to ensure that decisions align with the founder's ethical principles. Julian spoke quietly. I'm not here to run the company. I'm here to protect the people it affects. Margaret reached over and squeezed his hand briefly. Jonathan knew what he was doing when he designed this structure. The business expertise already exists in this room. What was missing was accountability. A younger board member, someone who'd been appointed during Victor's tenure, leaned forward. With all due respect, how do we explain this to shareholders? Stock prices will react to this kind of leadership change. Investors will demand answers about a minor holding ultimate authority. Then we tell them the truth, Margaret replied firmly, that this company was built on principles it lost sight of, and we're correcting course. Some investors will flee. Others will stay because they believe in ethical business practices, and will find new investors who share those values. Edward nodded in agreement. The trust anticipated market volatility. Part of its structure includes financial reserves specifically designed to stabilize stock prices during the transition period. Julian looked around the table at the faces of people decades older than him, people with years of experience he didn't possess. I know this is strange. I know you're used to a different kind of leadership, but my father spent years preparing for this moment. He knew the company would try to resist change. That's why he built protections that couldn't be ignored or overridden. Thomas spoke again, his voice gentler now. What happens next? Practically speaking, what are the immediate steps? Patricia distributed folders to each board member. Phase 1 involves a complete operational review. Every contract, every supplier relationship, every international operation gets audited against ethical standards outlined in the trust documents. Phase 2 restructures executive compensation to prioritize long-term sustainability over short-term profits. Phase 3 implements worker representation in major decision-making processes. The room erupted in overlapping questions and concerns. Some board members embraced the changes enthusiastically. Others looked pale, realizing how fundamentally their world was about to shift. The discussion stretched for over an hour, technical and detailed, as lawyers outlined the legal framework that would govern the transition. Throughout it all, Julian remained mostly quiet, listening carefully, occasionally asking questions that revealed how thoroughly he'd been prepared for this moment. He knew the trust documents. He understood the ethical frameworks. And when he did speak, his words carried a moral clarity that made arguments about profit margins sound hollow. Finally, as the initial session drew to a close, Edward made one more announcement. There's one additional matter. The trust documents specify that Julian's identity and role must be publicly disclosed within 72 hours. We'll be holding a press conference tomorrow morning. The room went silent. Public disclosure meant the world would know. Media scrutiny, investor panic, intense examination of every detail. Is that wise? Catherine asked carefully. Shouldn't we prepare the narrative more thoroughly first? The trust is explicit, Patricia replied. Transparency is non-negotiable. Secrets are what allowed the company to drift from its principles. We won't perpetuate that pattern. As the meeting finally adjourned, Julian was escorted not back to the small apartment with his handler, but to a secure residence owned by the trust. It was a modest house in a quiet neighborhood, far less ostentatious than where most board members lived, but comfortable and safe. Margaret accompanied him, along with Patricia and 2 security personnel who would maintain a permanent presence. Inside, Julian set his backpack down in the entrance hall and looked around at what would be his home for the foreseeable future. You did well today, Margaret said softly. Your father would be proud. Julian's composure cracked slightly. I keep thinking he's going to walk through a door somewhere. That this will all make sense if I could just talk to him. Margaret sat down on the couch, gesturing for Julian to join her. I knew your father for 20 years. I watched him build this company from nothing, and I watched it slowly consume him. The guilt over what happened to your mother ate at him every day. Tell me about her, Julian said. The man who trained me gave me facts, documents, timelines, but he couldn't tell me what she was really like. Margaret's eyes grew distant with memory. Elise was brilliant, not just intelligent, brilliant in a way that made everyone around her better. She could see connections others missed, solve problems that seemed impossible. When she and Jonathan worked together, they were unstoppable. What happened to her? That, Margaret said quietly, is a story you need to hear from her directly. Julian looked up sharply. She's alive. I know she is, but no one will tell me where. Because keeping you separate kept you both safe. But that changes now. Tomorrow, after the press conference, there are people who need to meet you, and questions that finally have answers. Across the city, Victor sat in his home office, surrounded by legal documents and empty coffee cups. He'd spent the entire evening making calls, consulting with attorneys, reaching out to allies. The responses had been uniformly disappointing. His personal lawyer had been blunt. Victor, everything they did was legal. The trust structure is airtight. Jonathan Ashford spent years building it with some of the best legal minds in the country. Fighting this in court would cost millions and likely fail. His calls to sympathetic board members had been awkward. Most made excuses about needing time to process the changes. A few were honest enough to admit they couldn't afford to oppose the trust's authority. The media consultant had been equally discouraging. The narrative is already established. Boy genius inherits company from deceased father, exposes ethical violations. You're the villain in this story. Anything you say publicly will only make it worse. Victor stared at his computer screen, reading news alerts about tomorrow's press conference. Speculation was already building online. Someone had leaked that major changes were coming to Halstead Global's leadership. Financial blogs debated what it might mean. Stock prices had frozen in anticipation. He pulled up security footage from the gala one more time, watching Julian walk through that ballroom. The boy who destroyed everything Victor had built with nothing but his existence. Julian watched as Edward explained the Lazarus Trust in carefully chosen words. The room remained quiet, journalists scribbling notes or recording every syllable. Cameras focused on Julian, analyzing every detail of his appearance. The trust's designated heir, Edward continued, is Jonathan Ashford's biological son, Julian Freeman Ashford. He has been verified through multiple independent sources and will assume controlling authority over company decisions moving forward. The room erupted. Questions shouted over each other. Camera flashes created a strobe effect. Julian stood still, exactly as he'd been trained, letting the chaos wash over him without reacting. Edward raised his hands for quiet. We'll take questions, but please wait to be called on. A senior business reporter from a major financial publication stood. Can you explain how a minor can legally hold controlling interest in a multi-billion-dollar public company? Patricia stepped to the microphone. The trust structure complies with all relevant securities laws. Julian doesn't function as a traditional CEO. He holds veto authority over major decisions through the trust's voting shares, while operational management remains with experienced executives. Another reporter, this one from a technology news outlet. What happened to Victor Halstead? Was he removed? Did he resign? Edward's expression remained neutral. Mr. Halstead's employment has been terminated in accordance with his contract provisions. We won't be discussing specific circumstances of that termination at this time. A woman from an investigative journalism website stood. Can you address rumors that this change is related to ethical violations in the company's overseas operations? The question hung in the air. This was the moment they'd prepared for. The first hint that this wasn't just about succession, but about accountability. Julian stepped forward to the microphone before anyone else could answer. My father created the Lazarus Trust because he feared the company he built would lose sight of its original purpose. He was right to fear that. Over the past 15 years, decisions were made that prioritized profit over people. That's going to change. The room exploded again with follow-up questions, but Edward moved to end the conference. Written statements with additional details will be distributed within the hour. Thank you. Security escorted them off the stage through a side exit. The moment they were clear of cameras, Julian felt his hands begin to shake. Margaret noticed and put a steadying hand on his shoulder. You did perfectly, she said. It didn't feel perfect. It felt like being on display. That's because you were, Patricia said pragmatically. Welcome to the reality of power. Privacy isn't part of the package. They returned to the secure residence, where Julian expected to continue the day's scheduled meetings and briefings. Instead, he found someone unexpected waiting in the living room. Michael Torres, the man who trained him for 13 years, stood beside the window. He turned when Julian entered, and his normally controlled expression showed something rare, emotion. You did well, Michael said simply. You watched every second. Michael glanced at Margaret and Patricia. Is it time? Margaret nodded. He needs to know everything, and she needs to see what he's accomplished. Julian's heart raced. My mother. You're taking me to my mother. Not quite, Michael replied. We're bringing her here. She's been in secure housing for 13 years. Moving her is complicated. But yes, you'll meet her today. The next hour passed in a blur of anxious waiting. Julian tried to occupy himself with documents and briefings, but his mind wouldn't focus. Every time a car pulled up outside, his head snapped toward the window. Finally, a black sedan arrived. Two security personnel exited first, scanning the area. Then a woman emerged from the back seat. She was in her mid-40s, black, with natural hair pulled back from a face that looked like an older version of Julian's own features. She wore simple clothes and moved with careful deliberation, like someone who'd spent years being invisible and was still adjusting to being seen. Julian stood frozen in the doorway as she approached. She stopped a few feet away, her eyes taking in every detail of him. Tears streamed down her face, but she didn't wipe them away. Julian, she whispered. He crossed the distance between them, and she pulled him into an embrace that felt like coming home after a lifetime of being lost. They stood there, mother and son, while everyone else quietly retreated to give them privacy. When they finally separated, they sat together on the couch, neither quite willing to let go of the other's hand. I'm sorry, she said immediately. I'm so sorry you had to grow up without me. I'm sorry for every birthday, every milestone, every moment I missed. Why? Julian asked. Why did you have to hide? Elise took a deep breath. Because they tried to erase me once, and I knew they'd do it again. Or worse. She told him the story then, the full truth that he'd only heard pieces of before. How she'd met Jonathan Ashford when she was a young researcher. How they collaborated on breakthrough technologies that became the foundation of Halstead Global. How she'd been not just his partner, but his equal in every way that mattered. We were building something revolutionary, Elise said. Not just profitable technology, but innovations that could help communities that had been left behind. Jonathan believed that companies could be engines of social good if structured properly. What happened? The board happened. As we expanded, the original investors wanted faster returns. They pushed for aggressive growth strategies that required cutting corners, using suppliers with questionable labor practices, ignoring environmental impact studies, prioritizing speed over safety. Her voice hardened with remembered anger. I found evidence of violations that could have brought criminal charges. Workers injured because of inadequate safety measures. Communities displaced without proper compensation. Research data falsified to meet regulatory requirements. I compiled everything and told Jonathan we had to go public with it. He didn't want to. He wanted to handle it internally. He believed he could fix things from within, convince the board to change course. But the board members saw me as a threat. They gave Jonathan an ultimatum: discredit me publicly and remove me from all official company records, or they'd force him out and bury the violations anyway. Julian felt anger building in his chest. So he chose the company. He chose to stay in position to protect what came next. Elise corrected gently. He knew they'd erase me regardless of his decision. But if he stayed, he could build something they couldn't control. The Lazarus Trust was his way of ensuring that someday the truth would come out. But you disappeared. I had to. After the public discrediting, I was unemployable in my field. My research was stolen and attributed to others. My patents were challenged and overturned. And then I realized I was pregnant. She squeezed his hand. That changed everything. Because Jonathan told me something the board didn't know, that he'd already started building the trust structure, that our son would inherit control if he survived to adulthood. They would have killed me, Julian said quietly. It wasn't a question. They would have done whatever was necessary to protect their power, Elise confirmed. So Jonathan arranged everything. Fake records that showed I'd left the country. A protection network that kept you hidden. Michael, who Jonathan trusted with both our lives. And 13 years of waiting to see if the safeguards would work. Did you know what I was doing? The training, the preparation? Michael sent encrypted updates once a month. I knew you were safe. I knew you were being prepared. But I couldn't be part of your life because any connection between us was too dangerous. Her voice broke. Do you have any idea how hard it was? Knowing you were out there, growing up, becoming who you are, and I couldn't even send you a birthday card. Julian leaned into her. I used to imagine what you were like. Michael told me facts, but I wanted to know everything else. What made you laugh? What your voice sounded like? If you ever thought about me? Every single day, Elise said fiercely. Every single day for 13 years. They sat together as the afternoon light shifted through the windows. Outside, the press conference was creating shockwaves through financial markets and media outlets. Victor Halstead was plotting his next move. The board was beginning the complex process of unwinding years of questionable decisions. But in that quiet living room, a mother and son reclaimed what had been stolen from them 13 years ago. Not just their relationship, but their identity, their story, their truth. Margaret appeared in the doorway after giving them an hour alone. I hate to interrupt, but there's something you both need to see. She turned on the television. A major news network was running a special report. The headline read, "Whistleblowers come forward. Inside Halstead Global's hidden violations." The report detailed testimonies from former employees, leaked documents about unsafe working conditions, evidence of environmental damage that had been covered up. Everything Elise had tried to expose 13 years ago was finally being publicly revealed. "Ow," Julian asked. Margaret smiled slightly. Jonathan didn't just create the trust. He made sure that when it activated, all the evidence he'd been quietly collecting for years would be released to journalists who'd been vetted for integrity. Victor's removal wasn't just about installing you. It was about ensuring the truth couldn't be buried anymore. Elise watched the screen with tears streaming down her face again. He kept his promise. He actually kept his promise. The report continued, interviewing workers from overseas factories, showing documentation of safety violations, detailing the systematic ways the company had prioritized profits over people. Public opinion was shifting in real time. What had started as curiosity about a young heir was transforming into outrage about corporate malfeasance. Julian's phone buzzed with a message from Patricia. Federal investigators have opened formal inquiries into 3 separate violations. This is going exactly as planned. He showed the message to his mother. She read it and nodded slowly. Your father knew this day would come. He built every piece of this structure knowing that exposing the truth would hurt the company in the short term. But he believed it was the only way to save it in the long term. What happens now? Julian asked. Now, Elise said, standing and pulling her son up with her, we rebuild. Not the company Jonathan started with, and not the monster it became under Victor. Something new. Something that actually lives up to the principles it was supposed to represent. Margaret joined them, and the 3 stood together watching news coverage of a reckoning that had been 13 years in the making. Outside, the world was reacting to revelations that would reshape one of the country's largest companies. But inside that house, 3 people who'd sacrificed everything for this moment allowed themselves a brief sense of victory. The hardest parts were still ahead. Legal battles, restructuring challenges, resistance from those who benefited from the old system. But today, truth had won its first major victory. And for the first time in 13 years, Julian Freeman Ashford stood, not as a hidden heir or a trained instrument, but as himself, with his mother beside him and his father's legacy finally honored. The revolution Jonathan Ashford had planned in secret was now unfolding in public view, and there was no going back. 3 days after the press conference, Julian sat with his mother in the secure residence, watching news coverage that seemed to never end. Every major network ran stories about Halstead Global's transformation. Financial analysts debated the company's future. Worker advocacy groups praised the revelations. Investors nervously awaited clarity on restructuring plans. But beneath the public attention, something darker was building. Michael Torres entered the living room with his phone pressed to his ear, his expression more tense than Julian had seen since the gala. He ended the call and looked directly at Elise. We have a problem. 3 different media outlets received anonymous packages this morning. Photos of you from the past month, your current location, claims that you're mentally unstable and manipulated Julian into this entire situation. Elise went pale. Victor, almost certainly, he's trying to discredit you the same way the board did 13 years ago. If he can make you look unreliable, he can cast doubt on everything Julian represents. Julian felt anger surge through him. Can't we trace where the packages came from? Already trying, but Victor's smart enough to use intermediaries. Michael's phone buzzed again. He read the message and his jaw tightened. It's worse. Someone leaked your medical records from 15 years ago. Therapy sessions after the discrediting. They're framing it as evidence of instability. Those records were sealed, Elise said, her voice shaking. How did money buys access, Margaret said, entering the room with Patricia close behind. Victor has resources and connections. He's wounded and desperate. That makes him dangerous. Patricia pulled up her tablet. It gets worse. We just received notice of legal challenges to the trust structure. 3 law firms representing anonymous clients filed motions questioning Julian's competency as a minor to hold fiduciary authority. The cases are flimsy, but they'll generate headlines. Julian stood abruptly. So what do we do? Just let him destroy my mother's reputation again. No, Margaret said firmly. We fight back, but we do it carefully. Over the next hours, they strategized. Patricia coordinated with the company's legal team to prepare responses to the lawsuits. Margaret reached out to journalists who'd covered the original whistleblower reports, providing them with context about Victor's tactics. Michael increased security protocols and began relocating both Julian and Elise to a new safe house. But Victor was moving faster than they anticipated. That evening, as they prepared to relocate, federal marshals arrived at the residence with a warrant. Not for arrest, but for temporary custody pending investigation of allegations against Elise regarding child welfare and potential fraud. This is insane, Michael said, blocking the doorway. What fraud? What allegations? The lead marshal, a woman named Davidson, looked uncomfortable but determined. Ma'am, We have a court order based on sworn testimony from multiple sources claiming that Dr. Freeman manipulated her minor son into a fraudulent takeover scheme. We're required to separate them pending investigation. Those sources are lying, Julian said desperately. This is Victor Halstead trying to. We don't make those determinations, Davidson interrupted gently. The court does. Your mother isn't being arrested. She's being placed in protective custody until a hearing can be scheduled. Elise pulled Julian close, her hands shaking. It's okay. We knew they might try something like this. It's not okay, Julian said, tears streaming down his face. I just got you back. And you won't lose me, Elise promised. This is just another lie, and lies don't last when the truth is this strong. They tried to take her then, but Margaret stepped forward. She doesn't go anywhere without legal representation present. And I'm calling every contact I have in the federal system to ensure this gets reviewed immediately. Patricia was already on her phone, mobilizing lawyers. Michael documented everything with his phone camera. The marshals waited with professional patience while chaos erupted around them. Finally, Elise made the decision herself. I'll go voluntarily. Fighting this now just gives them ammunition. Julian, remember what your father built. Remember why we did all of this. Don't let them make you doubt. She was escorted out to an unmarked vehicle. Julian watched from the window as it drove away, feeling like history was repeating itself in the cruelest way possible. Victor sat in a hotel suite across the city, watching news coverage of the custody situation with grim satisfaction. His lawyer sat nearby, cautiously optimistic. The allegations won't hold up long term, but they buy you time. Public opinion is shifting back toward questions about the legitimacy of the whole succession. How long until the hearing? 3 days minimum. Could stretch to a week if we file additional motions. Victor nodded. 3 days. A week. Time enough to chip away at the narrative, to plant seeds of doubt, to remind people that a child controlling a major corporation was absurd regardless of DNA tests or trust structures. His phone rang. A blocked number. He answered cautiously. Yes. Mr. Halstead, this is Margaret Crown. We need to talk. Victor's satisfaction faded. I have nothing to say to you. Then listen. I know what you're doing. I know you fabricated those allegations. And I know you think you're buying time to rebuild your position. But you're not. You're just making what comes next worse for yourself. Is that a threat? It's a fact. Jonathan built more protections than you know about. Every move you make against Julian or Elise triggers additional releases of evidence. About you specifically, Victor. About decisions you made. About people you hurt. Right now, you're facing termination and reputation damage. Keep pushing, and you'll face criminal charges. Victor ended the call, but her words echoed. He pulled up his computer and searched for recent leaks. Nothing new had appeared yet, but Margaret's certainty unsettled him. He made another call, this time to the private investigator. Find everything you can on Margaret Crown. Financial records, phone logs, everything. She knows something, and I need to know what it is. The emergency hearing was scheduled for the morning of the third day. Julian arrived at the federal courthouse with Patricia, Margaret, and a legal team that filled an entire row of the gallery. Media crews packed the hallway outside, cameras tracking every arrival. Victor entered through a side entrance, surrounded by his own lawyers. He didn't look at Julian directly, but his presence was a challenge in itself. Elise was brought in from federal holding, looking tired but composed. When she saw Julian, she smiled with such warmth that several people in the courtroom noticed. The judge, an older woman named Sandra Reeves, called the hearing to order. This is a preliminary review of allegations regarding custody and potential fraud in the matter of Freeman Ashford Family Trust succession. We're here to determine if there's sufficient cause to continue separation or if immediate reunification is appropriate. Victor's legal team presented first. They called witnesses who claimed Elise had been unstable years ago. They presented the leaked medical records, arguing they showed a pattern of psychological fragility. They painted Julian as a vulnerable child manipulated by a mother seeking revenge. It was skillfully done, and Julian watched with growing dread as doubt seemed to creep across the judge's expression. Then Patricia stood for the defense. Your Honor, what we're witnessing is a coordinated campaign of defamation by a terminated executive seeking to undermine legitimate succession. Every allegation presented today can be traced back to Victor Halstead or his associates. She presented phone records showing calls between Victor and the supposed witnesses, financial transfers that revealed payments made days before their testimonies, emails proving the medical records were obtained through illegal means. Furthermore, Patricia continued, the Lazarus Trust wasn't created 3 weeks ago in some scheme. It's been in place for 13 years, managed by one of the most respected trust administration firms in the country. Dr. Freeman didn't manipulate her son. She protected him from people who would have eliminated him to maintain their power. Margaret was called to testify. She spoke with quiet authority about knowing both Jonathan and Elise, about witnessing the original board's decision to discredit her, about keeping sealed documents that prove the trust's legitimacy. Jonathan Ashford was my friend, Margaret said from the witness stand. And watching him build these protections while knowing he was dying broke my heart. But he did it because he understood that power without accountability destroys everything it touches. His son isn't taking over a company. He's reclaiming his father's legacy from people who stole it. The judge listened carefully, asking pointed questions. She requested documentation, reviewed evidence, and finally called for a brief recess. During the break, Julian sat with Patricia in a side room. What do you think? He asked. I think we've proven the allegations are fabricated. But judges don't like being used as pawns in corporate battles. This could go either way. When they reconvened, Judge Reeves looked directly at Victor. Mr. Halstead, did you or did you not coordinate the allegations that led to this custody situation? Victor's lawyer stood. Your Honor, my client. I'm asking Mr. Halstead directly. Victor stood slowly. I acted to protect a company from illegitimate takeover. By fabricating child welfare allegations. By pursuing every legal avenue to challenge what I believed was. That's a yes, the judge said flatly. She turned to the court reporter. Let the record show that the petitioner has acknowledged coordinating the allegations. She looked back at Victor. Mr. Halstead, using child welfare systems to pursue corporate vendettas is reprehensible. I'm dismissing all allegations and ordering immediate reunification. Julian felt relief crash over him. Across the courtroom, Elise's shoulders sagged with released tension. But Judge Reeves wasn't finished. Furthermore, I'm referring this matter to the state attorney's office for potential criminal charges regarding fraudulent testimony and illegal acquisition of medical records. Victor's face went pale. His lawyers immediately huddled around him, whispering urgently. This hearing is concluded, Judge Reeves declared. Dr. Freeman is released from custody immediately. The courtroom erupted. Reporters rushed for exits to file stories. Julian crossed the room to his mother, and they embraced while cameras captured the moment. Victor was escorted out through a back entrance, surrounded by lawyers trying to minimize the damage. As he passed Margaret in the hallway, she spoke quietly enough that only he could hear. Jonathan gave you every chance to do the right thing. You chose this ending. The weeks that followed moved with surprising speed. Federal investigators expanded their inquiry into Halstead Global's practices under Victor's leadership. 3 executives who'd participated in the overseas violations resigned ahead of anticipated charges. The company's board voted to implement every reform outlined in the trust documents. Julian held his first official company meeting not in the boardroom, but in a community center near one of the factories that had been cited for violations. Workers, advocates, and board members sat together as he outlined a vision for what the company could become. My father believed that businesses should serve communities, not exploit them, Julian said. That means fair wages, safe conditions, and environmental responsibility. It means transparency about our operations and accountability when we fail. It means workers having voices in decisions that affect their lives. The response wasn't universal praise. Some investors pulled out, unwilling to accept reduced profit margins. Some executives left rather than work under the new structure. But others stayed, energized by the possibility of building something that balanced profit with purpose. Victor's legal troubles mounted. The state attorney filed charges related to the custody fraud. Civil suits from workers harmed by his decisions moved forward. His reputation, once gleaming, became synonymous with corporate greed and ethical failure. He never returned to the Halstead Global. Eventually, he left the city entirely, his career destroyed by his own desperate attempts to preserve it. 6 months after the gala, where everything began, Julian stood in the original Ashford building that had housed the company's first offices. It was being converted into a museum and educational center about ethical business practices. His mother stood beside him, fully restored to her rightful place as a pioneering researcher. Her contributions were being recognized formally, her name returned to patents, her work acknowledged in industry publications. Margaret joined them, looking at old photographs on the walls. "Jonathan would be so proud of both of you. I wish I could have known him," Julian said quietly. "You do know him," Elise replied. "Every principle you're fighting for, every change you're making, that's Jonathan. He lives in the work." That evening, Julian returned to something resembling a normal life. He'd enrolled in school, determined to have experiences beyond boardrooms and trust documents. His security detail remained discreet but present. The media attention had faded somewhat, though he'd never be fully anonymous again. As he sat in his room doing regular homework for a regular class, he thought about the gala, about walking into that ballroom in worn sneakers and a faded hoodie, about Victor's mockery and the crowd's laughter. He thought about how much had changed because one quiet sentence had been spoken at exactly the right moment. "I'm your boss." Not as revenge, not as conquest, but as truth finally finding its voice. The Lazarus Trust had done what Jonathan Ashford designed it to do. It had survived attempts to suppress it, outlasted those who tried to discredit it, and ultimately transformed a company that had lost its way. Julian Freeman Ashford, the boy everyone laughed at, had become the steward of his father's true legacy. And in boardrooms, classrooms, and communities affected by Halstead Global's operations, people were beginning to see that sometimes the most powerful thing in the world isn't wealth or status or control. Sometimes it's just the truth, spoken clearly by someone brave enough to stand in a room full of people who don't believe them, and wait for the moment when they have no choice but to listen. When those in power laugh at the powerless, who decides when the laughter stops? If you enjoyed this story of truth reclaiming what corruption tried to steal, hit that like button and subscribe for more stories where justice finds its voice.